All right, today we start spiritual lukewarmness. So, first, how God should be loved. God must be loved with our whole heart and with our whole mind and with our whole soul and with our whole strength. Okay. God is perfect, and he is all good, and he deserves to be loved perfectly. So these are general principles that everybody knows. We exist only to give him praise and worship, which is what we'll do in heaven. So every action of our lives must be a form of the praise of God, which means obedience to the commandments. God is glorified by the obedience of his creation. So the animals obey according to their instincts, and they glorify him in that way. And so the rational animals, meaning human beings, I think we better dispense with this cat. Why don't you go outside, kitty? Okay, there you go. All creatures exist for God. And creatures with intellect and will must give God the adoration of their intellects and their wills. Basically the same thing that I just said. Now, that said, what is spiritual lukewarmness? There are two loves to which the human heart may cling. The first is to the love of God, and the second is to the excessive love of self. So those are the two loves that compete in the human heart. We have seen that of itself, the love of God should be perfect and fervent. There is really no limit to the virtue of charity, how much we love God. It's not limited at all. And that it should preoccupy the soul. This love of God, this desire to please God, should be the preoccupation of the soul. We are created for that. It should be the beginning and the end of all of our activity. That's true both for religious and priests and lay people, everybody, each according to his own state. On the other hand, the very definition of mortal sin is the excessive love of some creature to the point that we prefer it over God. So in moral theology, we say aversio ad Deo et conversio ad creaturam. So it's an aversion from God, it's a turning away from God, and a conversion to the creature. So whenever we seriously disobey the law of God, we are converting to a creature, and we are turning our backs on God as the supreme end, ultimate end. We are making a creature our ultimate end. But every excessive love of a creature, however, is rooted in the excessive love of ourselves. We love the creature for ourselves. We take some joy or pleasure in the creature, whatever it is. Now, there's something in between mortal sin and perfect love of God. And that is the spirit of lukewarmness. Lukewarmness consists in a love of God which is hampered and thus very imperfect due to the venial love of creatures. Venial sin does not kill grace, but what it does is that it impedes the zeal of charity. The primary effect of sanctifying grace is the virtue of charity. So grace and charity go very much together. Right? So sanctifying grace is going to set the soul on fire, so to speak, and fire by its very nature goes up. But fire can be a very bright and hot fire, or it can be just a little fire that's ready to go out. So charity, because it has God as its object, naturally has a zeal to it. You see, I mean, what goes with charity is a zeal. That means a bright, warm, even hot charity, love of God. Charity means love of God. See, so venial sin, we say in English, puts a damper on that. In other words, it reduces it. But it does not extinguish it. So lukewarmness consists in the love of God which is hampered and thus very imperfect due to the venial love of creatures. It is very common in Catholics today, and it is, if not common, it is found among priests as well. It means the divided heart. There could be a certain fervor, there could be a certain practice of works of piety, etc. But the heart is divided. There is a love of creatures which is unhealthy, but not to the point of mortal sin. And it's like a disease. It has early stages and then advanced stages. In the advanced stages, it leads you to live on the brink of mortal sin, right at the edge of mortal sin. So you're ready to do anything as long as it's not a mortal sin. So what are the causes of spiritual lukewarmness? First, a defective spiritual nourishment. The spiritual life is a life just like any other life. In order to carry on its life functions, it needs wholesome spiritual food. So if you look at the animals, especially wild animals, even domestic animals, all they think about the whole day is what they're going to eat. every day is a hunt. Or the cows, all they do is eat the whole day. Insects. Every kind of animal is on a hunt every day. You get up in the morning and you're looking for food. So life naturally is looking for a sustenance. And also the spiritual life needs a sustenance. And this sustenance consists of prayer, devout reading, meditation, examination of conscience, the fulfillment of our duties of state and life, and exercise in practice of the virtues. So I'll read those again. Prayer, devout reading, meditation, examination of conscience, fulfillment of our duties of state and life, and exercise in the practice of the virtues. Those things feed the spiritual life. If these exercises are performed in a sluggish manner, without effort, then the soul is deprived of many graces. It becomes weak, and it is incapable of practicing the virtues of the Christian life, even in the face of little difficulties. It easily collapses. Just as if you were deprived of food, you would fall down very easily. Typically, the lukewarm Catholic is careless about his piety. He makes no effort to bring himself back from distraction in prayer. So he might pray, but his prayer is full of distraction. Now, distraction does not reduce the value of your prayer unless it is deliberate. All right, so if you start out well, and then you have a distraction which is indeliberate, that does not reduce the value of the prayer because of your original intention, because it's indeliberate. If something is indeliberate, it doesn't count in the sin category. But a sign of your fervor is to bring yourself back when you realize that you're distracted. Everyone gets distracted in prayer for one reason or another. Some more, some less. Depends on a lot of what your life is like to a great extent. You know, you're worrying about leaky pipes or something like that. And so his prayer eventually becomes one great distraction. Then the prayers become shortened due to haste. So you say your prayers as fast as you can. So you just at warp speed. Get it over with. See, that's the approach. And then finally, they're omitted altogether. Every spiritual act for the lukewarm person is a terrible burden. So if you feel that, that's a sign that you've got spiritual lukewarmness. He hates to do it, and he seeks excuses to omit it. Right? Now, sometimes there are legitimate excuses. Whenever you have an obligation of prayer, a legitimate excuse is an exchange with some work of charity or duty of state and life. So you might have a duty of state and life or some work of charity to do. See, that is where it's necessary. In other words, where the two are incompatible, or you have to give time to one and you can't give time to the other. Duties of state and life actually take precedence over obligations of prayer. So that is a legitimate excuse. But what is not a legitimate excuse is some sort of silly, and where you're looking for an excuse. Because you really don't like any kind of spiritual activity. He then makes no effort to know his faults and to dispel them. So this is the lukewarm person is not interested in knowing his faults. He's not interested in getting rid of faults. He doesn't care about his faults. He is content to live in a spiritually starved state, in which the minimum to God is the daily norm. This weak state of the soul leads to spiritual anemia. And just as one would become sick physically through improper diet, so in the spiritual life we become prey to spiritual germs, these being one of the three concupiscences, if not all three. The concupiscence of the eyes, the concupiscence of the flesh, and the pride of life. And the soul is invaded by unwholesome thoughts of sensuality or curiosity. Resistance to temptation is weak and half-hearted. These are the symptoms of it. So you can self-diagnose yourself. That might be redundant. And you court danger through imprudence. So you frequent occasions of sin. And so venial sins are multiplied at an alarming rate with little or no remorse about them. You're content with them. They're not mortal sins. And such a person lives constantly on the edge of mortal sin, right at the point of mortal sin, constantly. And pride gets into this soul because it has really no defense against anything. And so it delights in exterior qualities and in worldly successes. it looks around at others more lax than itself, and therefore feels complacent and holy. You see, well, I don't, do that sort of thing, or I don't commit that kind of sin, so I must be holy. It despises the fervent as being narrow or small-minded, or as overdoing it. This pride brings envy, jealousy, impatience, anger, and harshness in dealing with others. One of the signs of sanctity is interior peace and a pacific dealing with others. In other words, where you're not harsh with others, you might correct them for some reason, but that's the Beati Pacifici, blessed are the peacemakers. In other words, those who, it's not as if they're sitting down at the peace table. It means that they radiate the peace of their own soul, and that causes peace in others. It is said of St. Dominic that whenever he made a correction, that both were smiling at the end of the correction. And avarice also comes to bear, since the soul is now interested in purely external things, so love of money and what money can buy. And because it's worldly, you must make an impression. The soul wants to make an impression on other people with exterior things. Those are all symptoms of it. There are degrees of lukewarmness. In the beginning, you preserve a horror for mortal sin, but you do brush with, that means in English to come close to, deliberately, with the dangers that lead to mortal sin. But you are committing many deliberate venial sins. That is, venial sins that you know are venial sins and with which you are content or complacent at least. And you perform your spiritual duties through mere routine. So that's the early stages of it. You saw it in priests, actually, in the 1950s, who would do anything to say Mass as quickly as possible. Anything to get it over with. So, I may have told you before, instead of making the sign of the cross over the chalice like this, they would do this. It's true. Just to get through the Mass quickly. So that's why they welcome the Novus Ordo, because it's quicker. And that second canon, boom, in 3 or 4 minutes you're done. You could say that new Mass using the second canon in about 10 or 12 minutes. So you get out faster. And then you can do more interesting things, like shopping or going over and visiting people or So that's the lukewarm. Everything is some worldly attraction, not necessarily evil, but worldly. Filling yourself up with worldly attractions and worldly distractions, movies and distractions. I mean, there's nothing wrong with an occasional distraction that's known as recreation. But if your whole life is bent on that, where the main object of the day is, with whom am I going to have dinner tonight? What family am I going to visit for dinner? That's the main concern of the day. And reading the newspapers. You see, there's nothing wrong with reading a newspaper. It's the attraction that you have to it and the importance that you give to it, which is a sign of spiritual lukewarmness. And the routine and speed that you use in spiritual functions. Another example was, and this was before the council, and you can see why the council took place, priests watching football games, nothing wrong with that, and during the half times or the commercials, they would take their breviary and read some of the breviary, and then they would put it down and watch the rest of the game. That's spiritual lukewarmness. The progressed state of lukewarmness leads us to abandon horror for mortal sin. The love of pleasure actually brings us to the point of being sad that there are laws against it. There is only a feeble repelling of temptation. And you can easily fall into mortal sin in this state. You're right on the edge. Now, what are the effects of lukewarmness? First, God spurns the lukewarm. He said in the Apocalypse, I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold or hot, but because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will begin to vomit thee out of my mouth. The second is the blinding of our conscience. Lukewarm souls are constantly excusing their sins and rationalizing them away. In general, the poorest judge of whether you sinned or not is yourself. Because there's an obvious tendency to excuse yourself. Now, as I said, in general, because you could be what we call of delicate conscience, where, especially a priest, where he knows all of the moral theology that goes into a sin. So he might be able to make a good judgment concerning his own guilt. They thus form what we call the lax conscience and are incapable of discerning the gravity of what they do. See, there's three types of consciences. One is the scrupulous, which sees sin where there is none. The opposite is the lax, which sees no sin where there is. And then in the middle is the delicate conscience, which means you see sin where it is, and you don't see sin where it isn't. So you develop a lax conscience. Don't worry about it. It's only a venial sin. It's the enemy of spiritual perfection. The goal is stay out of hell, period. Don't overdo it. Just stay out of hell. Then there is a gradual giving into little things, and in so doing, the will breaks down resistance to the great things. So these little steps that you take lead to big steps. The soul detests the effort involved in resisting sin. It lets itself go to whatever natural desires present themselves. So the spirit of nature is very much involved in spiritual lukewarmness. You make every possible concession to the spirit of nature that you can without committing a mortal sin. But many times you fall because you can't do it that way. If you play with fire, you get burned. You offer frequent resistance to the inspirations of the Holy Ghost. Now, you haven't had ascetical and mystical, maybe some of you have. But the whole day, the Holy Ghost, through actual grace and by the gifts of the Holy Ghost, is inspiring you, not with words, but with ideas to do good things and to avoid evil things. You know when they're there. And you know when you're resisting them. Typically to duties of prayer, duties of state in life, urgings. You know what's right. Such a soul finds sermons or spiritual reading to be boring or a drag. Now, that said, there are some sermons that are boring, all right? Either from their content because they're trite, or because of the delivery, which can vary with the various talents of the person, or both. So if you have a trite sermon that is delivered by a boring person, you've got yourself a boring sermon, a really boring sermon, all right? So you shouldn't think, I thought that sermon was boring. I must be spiritually lukewarm. No, you shouldn't think that. There's variations in that. But you would see it in, for example, spiritual reading. If you find that to be burdensome and, I wish I were reading a detective novel or some other thing, not necessarily bad, just natural and of this world, where you just find it, this is a pain, where you have no interest in learning about, interpretation of sacred scripture or what the saints said or a spiritual conference. You might find this, really to be a bore and a drag, and you would rather be doing something else. That's a sign. You have to self-diagnose yourself all the time. Just as doctors do when they get sick. I'm sure they self-diagnose themselves. But as a priest, you're always looking inside and, what's going on, and I know all the rules. I tell people the rules, so I should know them myself. As I said, you will take a course in ascetical and mystical theology, which is very, very useful, especially in the confessional, where you have to tell people how to avoid sins, all the science of ascetical theology. And moral theology. I mean, that's why you go so long in the seminary. There's so much information to convey. And as I always say, the seminary is a success if when you're ordained, you realize how much you don't know. All right? Not how much you've learned, but how much you don't know. That's a good sign when you go to your ordination day. So I'll ask you that question. So make sure you give me the right answer. You can say, I don't know nothing. That would go fine in both Italian and Spanish, but it doesn't go in English. So, in Italian, non so niente. I don't know nothing. That's how they say it. It's two negatives, but that's the way they say it. It's good Italian, but it's not good English. There's no say nada, right? So I know some Spanish. You'd be surprised how much I know. I once taught a course in church history in Spanish. The fellow eventually left. He went back to Mexico. So I guess he didn't understand too well. But anyway, these are examples of the lukewarm lay Catholic. He will only go to church on Sunday. I mean, the idea of going on any other day is just unbearable. Why would you do that? What, are you crazy? You see, that's the way it's, you're overdoing it. Why would you go to daily mass? See, it's not that they can't, most people work and they can't go on the daily mass, but the very idea is repulsive to them. That's a sign of spiritual lukewarmness, that you confine your worship only to Sunday. And he arrives at the last minute, and he leaves as quickly as possible, or even early. So when the priest puts the chalice or the ciborium back in the tabernacle, well, you see, I've done the minimum, I've stayed until the communion, and now I can go. Even when the priest receives communion, you could go. It's considered a venial sin, but venial sins are nothing for these people. So you could walk in at the offertory, and the offertory begins, and leave after the priest receives communion. That fulfills the obligation. It's considered venial sin, but it fulfills the obligation of attending Mass. And, that would be music to their ears if they knew it, and then you could get out faster and go to breakfast, which is the real thing that you do on Sunday mornings. Is the most important thing. Is go to breakfast with your friends. All right, so you could get over to the restaurant and get the table while your friends come later. You see, that this is the way, this is typically spiritual lukewarmness. Skipping morning and night prayers often. So that's a sign of it. It's not necessarily a sign in the sense that, people may often confess that. First of all, remember that there is no law that says you must pray in the morning or pray at night. All right? There's no law that requires you to do that. So when people say, I skip my morning and night prayers, they're not confessing anything that you can absolve. Now, you do have a law to pray often, so that they might be sinning by not praying often. You'll see that in moral theology. But strictly speaking, it's not a sin. The same thing is true of the rosary. There is no law that requires you to say the rosary every day. But people will typically confess, I missed my rosary. See? And that's not a sin. So if you get that, they missed my morning and night prayers and I failed to say my rosary, You don't have anything to absolve yet. See? So you should inform them of that neither of those things is a sin. I mean, it's laudable to say the rosary, it's laudable to say your morning and night prayers, but you're not breaking any laws. But they do have to pray often. See, so that is a law. So, but typically that people do pray at those times, and skipping that could be a sign of spiritual lukewarmness. So you'd have to listen for other things that he's saying. And typically spiritual lukewarm people have such a lax conscience that they don't say anything else. and they don't recognize sin where there is sin, and frequenting occasions of sin and all sorts of things like that. They have a very dull conscience, so. He goes to confession once a year, that's it, because that's the law. You can't overdo it. And also women typically will wear all the latest fashions regardless of standards of modesty. They watch either dirty or borderline television or other forms of visual, entertainment. Not really hardcore. They would stay away from that, but things that are what you call dirty and bawdy and or borderline. That doesn't bother me, they say. It's a sign of a lukewarm person. As saying that they go either to dirty or borderline movies. And they are very concerned about what people are thinking or saying. What other people think about them, or just general gossip. On the social level, the church itself takes on this quality of lukewarmness. So if you have a lot of lukewarm people, then in a certain way the church itself takes on a lukewarmness. So lukewarm parents, for example, beget lukewarm children. So all of those habits that I spoke about are communicated to the children. I'll just finish this. And sometimes they grow up to become priests and nuns, and they carry this infection in with them. And then, in turn, they set the standard of piety and observance according to this low level. An example is the way parents uphold worldly achievements at the expense of spiritual considerations. Their child has gone off to the university and has become an atheist, debauched, and liberal. But he has a degree, and we're so proud of our son, even though he's debauched, liberal, and an atheist. We're proud of him. That's spiritual lukewarmness. And finally, the remedies. I'm almost done. The first is to go to confession often and follow diligently the counsels of the priest. And it would be preferable to frequent the same confessor whenever possible. And that's, of course, true for clergy. Lukewarmness in clergy can be seen in the way they say their office, the way they say Mass, their prayer life in general, their interest in secular entertainments and people, not in a way that, where you're taking care of the flock, but just conversing with people and having, I don't know, just an excessively human contact with their faithful. Second is fervent practice of acts of piety. This is a remedy, particularly those which excite other acts of piety, such as mental prayer, examination of conscience, and renewal of the desire to do all for God. You could add spiritual reading. Spiritual reading is a wonderful, wonderful remedy for all of your problems. That daily dose of reminding yourself of the high realities of life and death. And also, spiritual reading feeds your meditation. There are some authors that say you can't really do meditation unless you're doing spiritual reading. And finally, thirdly, performance of duties of state and life with greater earnestness. Saint Francis de Sales says the greatest way in which we sanctify ourselves is by the performance of our duties of state and life. So with the more, let's say, energy and attention that you give to those things for God's sake, the less you will be lukewarm. The warmer you will get.